The sensor array on Kuluth Plateau runs for 11 kilometers along a basalt ridge that used to be the floor of a shallow sea. When the inland ocean dried up, 40 million years before anyone was counting, it left behind a shelf of black rock so flat and so dense that the Quartz engineers chose it for the deep-range acoustic arrays without hesitation. The rock conducts. Nothing else on the plateau matters. There are no cities up here, no transit links, no amenities worth naming. There is the array, there are the maintenance sheds. There are the 6 of us who staff the winter rotation, and there is the cold. I had been on Kuluth for 9 months when the Kethara Retrieval Wing came home. My name is Davan Reth. Was, the time, a Class 3 sensor operator for the Accord Frontier Monitoring Division, which is a title that sounds more impressive than it is. What it meant in practice was that I sat in a heated prefab shelter at the north end of the array and watched screens. The screens showed gravitational disturbance data piped in from the deep space relay buoys the Accord had seeded along every historical approach vector going back to the first survey era. When something big moved through the outer system on one of those vectors, the buoys noticed. When the buoys noticed, told me. When the screens told me, I wrote it down, classified it, and forwarded it to the Accord relay station at Velith Orbital, which is in geostationary orbit, roughly above where I was sitting. 9 months on Kuluth and I had forwarded 42 reports. 38 of them were ice bodies. 3 were commercial haulers running late on their logged approach windows, which is technically a relay station problem, but always ends up in my queue anyway. 1 was the Accord's own 9th Survey Wing, running a dark transit exercise without filing the proper notification, generated a very short and very cold reply from my supervisor at Velith Orbital, addressed not to me but to the captain of the 9th Survey Wing, with me copied for my own records. Nothing in 9 months had been what the array was designed to find. I was eating dinner when the first gravity signature registered. The alert tone the array uses for historical approach vectors is different from the tone it uses for ice bodies, and different again from the tone for logged commercial traffic. The designers made it that way deliberately. You can be half asleep and still know before you open your eyes category of thing you are dealing with. The tone for historical approach vectors is low and sustained, a long single note that climbs 3 steps and then holds. I had heard it in training. I had not heard it on duty. I set my fork down. I walked to the primary console. I looked at the screens. 22 gravity signatures. Moving in tight formation, military spacing, not commercial scatter. Approach vector Kethsine, which is the 7th historical approach route, cataloged under the Kethara colonial era files. The files went back 35,000 years, to a time before anyone now living could trace their family line. The buoys had the Kethara signature on record, because every approach buoys in the system carried the full historical catalog, which runs to 11 million entries, and is updated quarterly from the Accord's archive authority in Theron City A. The buoys don't think, they match and they report. They had matched and they had reported, and now the report was sitting on my screen. 22 vessels on Keth 7. Range, approximately 4.2 astronomitudes, moving at a cruise velocity consistent with a formation that was not in any hurry, because it had no reason to be. Sat down. I read the data 3 times. I confirmed the approach vector classification manually, which is a step you are supposed to perform anyway, but which most operators skip when the alert comes in at dinner. I did not skip it. The classification held. I opened the relay channel to Velith Orbital. Velith, this is Kuluth Array, Operator Reth. I have a confirmed historical vector contact. Keth 7, 22 vessels. Range 4.2 AU, transmitting full packet now. I came back in 40 seconds, which told me that someone at Velith was already awake and paying attention. Kuluth, Velith copies. Packet received. Stand by. I stood by. The array tracked the formation. The 22 signatures held their spacing perfectly. No drift, no straggling, no variance. They were moving the way military formations move when the commanding officer is confident. When you know where you are going and you have no reason to doubt the welcome. The reply from Velith came back 11 minutes later. 11 minutes is long for a relay acknowledgement. It told me the packet had gone up the chain before anyone answered me. Kuluth Velith. Contact is confirmed and classified Kethara Retrieval Wing. Probable designation. Protocol 19 is in effect from this moment. You are to maintain continuous tracking. Log all telemetry at maximum resolution, and hold your channel open to this relay. Do not break contact. Firm. Protocol 19. I had to look it up. I am not ashamed to say that. Protocol 19 was in the manual, under a section I had read exactly once during orientation, and not consulted since, because in 9 months nothing had required it. The section was titled, Historical Faction Return Events. Standing Response Posture. Protocol 19 was the response posture for confirmed approach by a faction with a historical claim classification. It did not mean we were in danger. It meant that every relevant authority in the Accord was now being notified simultaneously, that certain assets were now being repositioned whether or not I understood why, and that my job was to watch, record, nothing outside of official channels. Veleth, Caleth confirms. Protocol 19 in effect, channel held open, continuous tracking active. You're doing fine, Reth. Stay on it. I stayed on it. The Kethara, I should explain who they are, because the name appears in the historical files with a specificity that makes some people assume they are well known, and they are not. Not to the general population. They are known to archivists and to certain categories of Accord defense planners, but the average person walking the streets of Theron City or taking the rail through the new districts along the Adriatic Shelf would not recognize the name any more than they would recognize the designation of any other faction that left Earth's vicinity 35,000 years ago. What I knew from the files, and I read them that night, all of them, while the formation crept inward along Keth 7 at its unhurried cruise, was this: the Kethara had been here before, not visiting, not passing through, here, as in, they had claimed the planet. The historical file used the word administered, which is the Accord's diplomatic vocabulary, for a situation that the people being administered would have described differently. The Kethara had arrived approximately 35,300 years before my dinner was interrupted by their gravity signatures, had established what the file called a colonial administrative presence, had remained for somewhere between 800 and 1,000 years before departing. The reasons for their departure were not fully documented. The file noted 3 competing hypotheses: internal Kethara political disruption, and external military pressure on home systems requiring reallocation of resources, and what one archived scholar, writing 4,000 years after the fact, had called a sensible reassessment of the colony's long-term utility. The scholar had not elaborated. The file did not speculate further. What the file was clear about was what they had left behind when they went. Not much. Some subsurface structural remnants in a region that was now the Theron Basin. Fragments of material, consistent with Kethara construction standards. A set of administrative markers the Accord's translators had taken 200 years to fully decode them, that constituted, in aggregate, a statement of territorial claim and an instruction to any subsequent inhabitant to register their presence with Kethara Colonial Authority for assessment. The markers were in the Accord's Central Archive in Theron City. They had been there for 31,000 years, studied, documented, and filed. The Accord's legal position on them had been established 9,000 years ago by the Theron Convention on Historical Claim Resolution, which held, in language I am paraphrasing from memory, that administrative presence followed by voluntary withdrawal for a period exceeding 1,000 years, during which the territory was continuously inhabited and independently developed by an indigenous or subsequent population, constituted a forfeiture of administrative claim under any recognized code of interstellar law. The convention had been ratified by 47 galactic bodies. The Accord's Archive Authority had maintained the ratification record continuously 9,000 years and updated it quarterly alongside the buoy catalogs. 35,000 years. That was the gap. That was how long ago the Kethara had left. That was how long the markers had been in the archive. And now 22 vessels were moving down Keth 7 at cruise velocity, steady and unhurried, as though they already knew what they were coming back to. My 5th cup of coffee went cold while I watched them. I kept reading the file. There was not much else to do. The array was tracking. The channel to Veleth was open and silent. Outside, the plateau held its cold and its dark in equal measure. And the stars above the basalt ridge were the same stars they had always been, indifferent to everything that moved between them. The Kethara file runs to 640 pages in the Accord's standard archival format, counting the appendices. Most of those pages are reconstruction work, the careful, unglamorous scholarship of people who spent careers piecing together a picture from fragments. Physical analyses of the subsurface remnants, spectroscopic comparisons between Kethara construction materials and similar finds from other colonial-era sites. 4 separate translation attempts at the administrative markers spanning 800 years, and 3 schools of xenolinguistic methodology before the modern consensus rendering was adopted. A 400-page legal commentary produced by the Accord's Historical Claims Tribunal, setting out in exhaustive detail why Article 14 of the Theron Convention applied, how it applied, and what the evidentiary standard would be if the application were ever contested. What the file did not have, what no file has, because the Accord builds its records from what it can verify, was anything that told me what the Kethara themselves had thought, what their administrators had written in their own records during the colonial period, what the withdrawal order had actually said, whether the departure had been orderly or hurried, resigned or confident, whether anyone in the Kethara hierarchy had ever revisited the question of this system in the 35,000 years since, whether it had simply sat in some administrative inventory, flagged for reassessment, accumulating dust in whatever form Kethara administrative dust takes. 640 pages, and the most important question was the one they couldn't answer. I finished the file at approximately 3 in the morning, local plateau time. The formation had not changed course, had not changed velocity, had not shown any sign of having received a response from us, which made sense, because we had not sent one, and the buoys don't broadcast, they only relay. The wing was moving in the dark, confident. It did not know we were watching. It did not know Protocol 19 was in effect. It did not know that 36 hours earlier, before I had even heard the alert tone over my dinner, the Accord's defense coordination at Veleth had already begun repositioning the screen. I made more coffee. I watched the screens. The signatures were closer now than they had been. Not close in any absolute sense, still 2 days out. But the numbers on the range display were smaller than when I had sat down, and that felt meaningful in a way I could not fully articulate. I am not a sentimental person. Generally, I am a sensor operator. I log what I see. But there was something in those shrinking numbers. The slow, unhurried reduction of the distance between what was coming and what was waiting that made me feel the weight of the whole span of time in a way the file had not quite managed. 35,000 years is a number you can read about. Watching the range counter tick down from a formation that did not know what it was, approaching was something different. I thought about the person who had built the first relay buoy on Keth 7, not the individual. I did not know the individual. The historical record does not preserve the names of junior engineers 11,000 years out of date. But the act someone 11,000 years ago had seeded a buoy on Keth 7 specifically because the record showed Keth 7 as a historical Kethara approach vector. Had done the work of seeding it, calibrating it, testing it, logging it in the catalog. Probably never expected it to trigger. Had done the work anyway, because the work was the point, not the expectation. That buoy had been replaced 7 times in 11,000 years, as the technology evolved and the components aged out. Replacement record was in the maintenance appendix of the Kethara file. 7 generations of hardware, each logged and certified, the calibration records updated each time, the approach vector designation preserved through every transition. 7 generations of engineers who had maintained a capability they had no particular reason to believe they would ever need. The 8th generation of hardware was what had found the wing tonight. My 5th cup of coffee went cold while I watched them come. The thing about working a deep-range sensor post-to-post is that contact events unfold slowly. The formation was 3 days out when I first logged it. 3 days is a long time to sit with a thing. My 2 colleagues on the night shift, Sen Orath and a taciturn man named Galveth, who had been on Caliph for 6 years and had strong opinions about the morning tea rotation. Came in at midnight, and I briefed them both. Galveth read the contact data twice, nodded once, and took his station. Sen asked me 3 questions and then sat very still for a while. Neither of them said what they were thinking. We had all read Protocol 19 by that point. What Protocol 19 did not spell out explicitly, but any sensor operator above Class 2 understood intuitively, was the shape of what was being prepared on the other end of our open channel to Velith Orbital. Velith was not just a relay station. It was the coordination hub for the Accord's outer defense network in this hemisphere. When Protocol 19 went into effect and a packet went up the chain from a historical vector contact, the chain did not simply pass the information along for filing. It activated a response posture that had been planned, rehearsed, and refined across many thousands of years of Accord defense doctrine, specifically for this category of event. The Accord's defense planners were not naive people. They had always known, because the files told them, because the markers in the archive told them, because the historical record of every colonial era departure was part of the standard intelligence assessment updated every decade, that some fraction of the factions that had come and gone from Earth's vicinity had not gone willingly, had not gone permanently, and had left with the assumption that might someday return to whatever they had left behind. The Accord had built accordingly. I knew the broad outlines. Anyone with a Class 3 clearance and access to the Open Channel's defense summary knew broad outlines. What I could not see from the Caliph Plateau, tracking 22 inbound vessels on my screens, while Galveth refilled my cold coffee without being asked, was the specific shape of what was now moving into position. I learned it later. I will describe it as I learned it, because the sequence matters. By the time the Kethara Retrieval Wing cleared the outer system marker buoys, and would have had their first clear, visual confirmation of Earth's current orbital environment, at a range of roughly 0.8 astronomutes, the following assets were in place. The Varith Accord Defense Corridor, which is a formal designation for the integrated network of 8 orbital defense platforms arranged in 2 offset rings at approximately 850 and 1,200 kilometers altitude, had been at full operational status for 31 hours. Each platform carries its own power system, its own sensor suite, its own long-range engagement capability, crew complement that I am not at liberty to specify, but that is sufficient to operate all systems simultaneously without any external coordination requirement. The platforms do not need Velith to function. They do not need each other to function, though they work better together. They were designed, over many generations of iterative refinement, to be available and capable before any external warning could guarantee sufficient response time. The response time question had been studied extensively. The platforms were the answer. The forward warship screen, which is what the Accord calls the first-line vessel deployment, positioned between the inner system and any inbound contact on a historical approach, vector, consisted at the time of the Kethara contact of 193 vessels, ranging from fast response corvettes to 3 full-sized capital warships. The capital warships, I knew their names from the public registry. They were not secret, were each between 1 and 2 kilometers in length. They had been in transit from their patrol stations for 36 hours before I logged the contact, because the Accord's buoys had detected the formation before my array had, and the initial notification had gone up the chain before Protocol 19 was formally declared. Screen was in position before the Kethara Wing would have had any optical or sensor confirmation of Earth's current orbital situation. The Accord Legal Archive Transmission Authority, which is a body most people have never heard of, and which has no weapons and no ships and no presence in orbit, had prepared a transmission package that had been staged for automated relay since Protocol 19 was declared. The package contained a complete certified copy of the Accord's independent habitation record for Earth and its immediate orbital environment, covering the full 35,000 years since the Kethara departure, population records, infrastructure logs, territorial claim filings, the complete text of the Theran Convention on Historical Claim Resolution, including all 47 ratifying signatories, The Accord's own 31,000 years of continuous governance documentation, and the decoded text of the Kethara administrative markers, with attached legal analysis establishing that said markers constituted a superseded claim under Article 14 of the Theran Convention. The transmission package was 9,417 pages in the Accord's standard documentary format. It had been maintained, updated, and legally certified every decade for 9,000 years. A version of it had been updated as recently as 8 months before the Kethara contact as part of the Accord Archive Authority's standard quarterly review cycle. The transmission was not a response to the Kethara contact. The transmission had always been ready. The contact simply triggered its sending. I did not know all of this on the night I first logged the contact. I learned pieces of it through the open channel to Fella to Valid as the 3 days unfolded. Galveth and Sen and I tracked the formation, logged the telemetry, held the channel open, ate our meals in shifts, and slept in 2-hour rotations, so that someone was always at the primary console. The other 3 members of our rotation, stationed at the South Array, 1.5 kilometers away, were doing the same. We talked to each other on the internal comms. We did not talk about what was coming. There was not much to say that the screens were not already saying. On the second day, Sensi asked me whether I thought they knew. Know what? I said. What they're going to find. I thought about that for a while. The formation had not changed its velocity or its spacing. It was moving the way something moves when it has a destination it has been to before and expects to recognize on arrival. No, I said. Don't think they know. Sen nodded and went back to her screen. The Kethara Retrieval Wing crossed the 0.5 astronomos threshold at 3:40 hours on the 3rd day. I was at the console. Galveth was asleep. Sen was making tea. Threshold crossing is not a physical event. There is no line drawn in space at 0.5 astronomical nits, but it is the range at which the formation would have had reliable passive sensor coverage of Earth's orbital environment. It is the range at which the Accord's pre-positioned assets would have become impossible to misread. I imagine what the Kethara commander saw, though I have no direct record of it and would not claim otherwise. They would have come out of their final transit reduction, dropping from faster than light propagation to sublight approach speed in the orderly, practiced way that military formations do it, and they would have had their passive sensors sweep the inner system as a matter of standard procedure. What the sweep would have returned was not what they had left 35,000 years ago. They would have seen the 8 orbital platforms first, because the platforms are large and they do not hide. The platforms carry no active stealth. The Accord's philosophy on this point has always been that the existence of the platforms is itself a message, and that concealing them would be wasteful of what they communicate. What they communicate is visible from 0.5 astronomicals with standard passive sensors. Then they would have seen the forward warship screen. 193 vessels arranged in a formation that any military commander would recognize as deliberate. Not a transit formation, a reception formation. The spacing between the screen's elements is calculated to be legible at range. This is not a patrol. This is not coincidence. This is not a commercial convoy that happened to be passing. This is what is here, and this is what it is doing. Then they would have seen Earth itself. 35,000 years of construction, the orbital infrastructure that circles it, the elevated transit platforms visible from low orbit, the light patterns on the night side that no dead or abandoned world would produce. And then their comms system would have registered the incoming transmission from the Accord Legal Archive Transmission Authority. 9,417 pages, arriving at the standard certified document relay rate, beginning with a cover notation in the Kethara's own administrative language, which the Accord's translators had spent 600 years reconstructing from the decoded markers. That read, approximately, to the commanding authority of the inbound Kethara formation. This certified record is transmitted pursuant to the Theran Convention on Historical Claim Resolution, Article 14, for your acknowledgement and retention. I know what the cover notation said, because it was in the Velith briefing summary that came through our open channel at 0412 hours. 3 minutes after the 0.5 astronomical threshold crossing, I read it twice. Then I read it a third time. At 057 hours, The Kethara Wing's lead vessel transmitted on the Accord's standard diplomatic channel. The transmission was short. Velith relayed it to us in full, because Protocol 19 specifies that the originating monitoring post receives all diplomatic channel traffic in real time. The translation, provided by the Accord's automated relay system, was, "This is Kethara Retrieval Wing Vantek, operating under Standing Colonial Reassessment Authority, Class 1. We observe your orbital presence. Quest clarification of current administrative status." I read that and sat back in my chair. Request clarification of current administrative status. 35,000 years of continuous human habitation, 9,000 pages of certified legal record transmitted to their command channel 40 minutes ago, 193 warships in reception formation, 8 orbital defense platforms in full operational status, and the lights of every city on Earth's night visible without magnification, and their opening transmission was a request for clarification of current administrative status. I did not blame them. Not then and not now. They had left believing they were leaving a property. They had come back, expecting either an empty property or a squatter situation requiring management. They were colonial administrators. The category of thing they had found, a world that had been independently inhabited, continuously governed, legally certified, and militarily defended for 35,000 years by a species that the Kethara records almost certainly classified as a subsidiary population, was not a category they had built their planning around. The world they had come back to reclaim did not exist. It had stopped existing a very long time before they turned around to come home. At 0521 hours, the Accord's response transmission went out from Velith on the diplomatic channel. It was not 9,000 pages. It was 3 sentences. I have the text. I memorized it without meaning to, the way you memorize things that arrive at 4 in the morning when you have been awake for 19 hours and every other thought been cleared out of your head by concentration. It said, "To Kethara Retrieval Wing Vantek, transmission is acknowledged. The independent worlds has transmitted to your command channel a certified record of continuous independent habitation, governance, and territorial control for Earth and its orbital environment, covering the period from your administrative withdrawal to the present date. That record constitutes the complete and legally binding answer to your query. We are prepared to discuss the record at your convenience. We are not prepared to discuss any alternative administrative classification." And then, there is no ambiguity in our position. We say this without hostility. That last sentence was the one that stayed with me. Not a threat, not a boast. Statement of the situation's geometry. The Accord knew what it had. The Kethara were now beginning to understand what it had. There was no gap between those two understandings that weapons could close. Because the gap was not a military gap. It was a 35,000-year gap in the record of a world that had not stayed the same while the Kethara were away. The wing held its position at 0.4 astronomical units. It did not advance. It did not retreat. The formation held its spacing, which was still the confident spacing of a military unit that had not yet made a decision, which was no longer moving as though it already knew where it was going. At 0614 hours, the wing's lead vessel transmitted again. "We are reviewing the transmitted record. We request a 72-hour communication hold while our legal assessment team completes initial evaluation." Velith replied in 6 minutes. 72-hour communication hold is granted. The Accord's position is unchanged. We will respond to any transmission you initiate during this period. And then there was silence. Those 72 hours were the strangest 3 days of my professional life, though professional is a word that sits oddly in the context of a 9-month sensor posting on a cold plateau where the primary human interaction, T-rotation, the formation sat at 0.4 astronomical units. We tracked it. The screen held its reception formation. The platforms held their operational status. Nothing moved that did not need to move. Galvith made very good soup on the second day of the hold. He refused to explain the recipe, which he said he had been making for 40 years and which he had given to his daughter, and no one else. We ate it in 2 shifts, so the console was never unattended. I told him it was the best thing I had eaten on Calith. 'Twas true, without being a high bar. and he accepted this with the same expression he used for most things, which was somewhere between satisfaction and indifference. Sometime during the first day of the hold, a brief summary came through the Velith channel, describing the composition of the screen in more detail than the general defense summary I had previously accessed. 3 capital warships. Endurance of Theron, Seaseer, Kelvath II, Challenge, and the Accords Meridian. All names I recognized from the public registry, because the capital warships are not secrets. They are known quantities, and the Accord's position on this is consistent with its position on the defense platforms. What is visible is a message. Fees Gerd. Endurance of Theron was the oldest of the 3, commissioned 2,300 years ago, and refitted 4 times since. Original keel still carrying the stress signatures of a construction era that predated several of the Accord's current member states. She was 4 kilometers from bow to stern. Her current commanding officer was a woman named Adrian Calleth, whose name I did not know at the time, but looked up afterward because I wanted to know who was sitting in the Endurance command station while I was eating Galveth soup. I also thought, during those 72 hours, about the people I could not see and whose names I would never know. The archivist, or the team of archivists, more likely, who had updated the 9,000-page transmission package 8 months before the contact. Somewhere in Theron City, in a building I had never visited, someone had sat down 8 months ago and gone through the certification review, page by page, verifying that the population records were current, that the infrastructure logs reflected the most recent construction data, that the Theron Convention ratification record was up to date. They had done this not because they expected the package to be sent, because it was the quarterly review cycle, and the quarterly review cycle meant you did the review. The package had sat in its staged transmission queue for 8 months, maintained and certified, and then at 0012 hours on the morning of my contact log it had been triggered and sent, and the Kethara had received it, and 9,417 pages of meticulous record-keeping had spoken on behalf of 35,000 years of human civilization in a language that any administrative authority in the galaxy would recognize. The engineer who had recalibrated the Keth 7 buoy during its most recent maintenance cycle, 18 months before the contact. Whoever had written the software update to the Accord's automated signature matching system that had allowed the buoys to correctly classify Kethara drive signatures from a 35,000-year-old catalog entry as a probable match against a formation using modern Kethara technology. The legal scholar who had drafted the cover notation in reconstructed Kethara administrative language certified it, logged it, and filed it in the staging queue, where it had been waiting for the contact trigger. None of these people had been in the room when the wing crossed the outer marker. None of them had seen the alert tone. None of them would appear in the contact summary under their own names. The work they had done was invisible in the way that all correct maintenance is invisible. You only notice it when it fails, and it had not failed. That is the thing about preparedness at this scale. It is not a single decision, not a single brilliant act, not a lone intelligence who saw further than the rest. It is 1,000 small decisions, made across a span of time long enough to encompass the rise and fall of multiple civilizations, each one slightly too early to know for certain that it will matter, each one made anyway, because the alternative is the kind of morning I might have had if the buoy had been calibrated differently, or the staging queue had been cleared during a budget review 300 years ago, or the legal scholars of the Theron Convention had produced a document that was 600 pages rather than 9,000. 9,417 pages. That is how much it takes to close a 35,000-year gap. Sen and I talked during the long, quiet stretches. Not about the wing. There was nothing new to say about the wing, but about everything adjacent. She was 12 years older than me, and had been on censor postings for 20 of those years. And she had thoughts about the historical record that I found worth listening to. She pointed out something I had not fully absorbed in my reading of the Kethara file. that the file was written from the Accord's perspective, as all the files were, and that the Accord's perspective did not include direct access to Kethara records from the colonial period. What the Accord knew about the Kethara administration was reconstructed from physical remnants, decoded markers, and the analysis of scholars working across many centuries. The Kethara's own account of why they had left, what they had believed they were leaving behind, and what they had told themselves about the situation in the 35 millennia since. None of that was in the file. None of that was knowable until the wing opened a communication channel and said something. They might think they were doing us a favor, Sen said. Leaving. Some kind of intended return. Management of a long-term asset. 35,000 years is a long management cycle, I said. The record doesn't specify what their internal planning horizon looks like. She was looking at the screen, not at me. They might not experience time the same way we do. I thought about that. I thought about arriving somewhere after 35,000 years, with a colonial reassessment team and a Class 1 authority designation, moving at unhurried cruise velocity because you have no reason to hurry, because you are returning to a property in a backwater system that has been sitting quietly while you attended to other business. I thought about what it would feel like when the passive sensors came back with data that did not match the expected return. I did not feel contempt for them. I want to be clear about that because I think contempt would be the easy response, and I do not think it would be the accurate one. What I felt during those 72 hours was something more like the particular sadness you feel when you understand that someone has badly misjudged a situation, not out of malice, but out of a failure to account for the one variable they hadn't thought to account for: time. Not just the passage of it, but what happens inside time when a people are left to their own accounting of it. 35,000 years. That is the number. It is very large. It is hard to hold in your mind as a continuous thing. The Accord's Archive Authority holds it, because that is what archive authorities are for. The humans who built the first defense platform, and there was a first one, built 11,000 years ago in a form that the current platforms resemble only in concept, did not know for certain that the Kethara would come back. They knew the Kethara had left. They knew the markers said to register your presence for assessment. They knew that any faction that plants administrative markers and departs voluntarily is a faction that has at least considered the possibility of turn. The first platform was not built because someone was certain. It was built because the Accord's founders decided that the cost of being wrong was worth accounting for, and that the appropriate account was a defense platform, not a prayer. Every subsequent platform was built for the same reason: the warship doctrine, the screen formation protocols, the legal archive transmission authority and its 9,000-page certified record. All of it was built for the same reason. Not certainty, not panic, not heroism. Just the patient, unglamorous work of a people who had decided to be ready and had stayed ready across an expanse of time that would break most organizational structures simply under the weight of its own length. The Accord does not celebrate preparedness. There is no holiday for it. There are no monuments to the archivists who maintained the buoy catalogs, or the engineers who redesigned the platforms for the 7th time, or the legal scholars who updated the Tharan Convention ratification record. The work is simply done, continuously, because it is the work that needs to be done, and because the alternative is to discover one morning that 22 military vessels are on your historical approach vector, and you have nothing to say to them that amounts to anything. We had something to say. At 1104 hours on the 3rd day of the hold, 63 hours into the 72, the Wing's lead vessel transmitted again, not at the scheduled end of the hold, early. Accord Velith, we have completed our initial legal assessment. We find the transmitted record to be substantial and require further consultation with Kethara Administrative Authority before any formal position can be established. We are requesting authorization to withdraw the outer system on marker at Keth 3 for the duration of our consultation. We estimate the consultation period at 6 to 14 standard months. We request that the current communication channel remain open for our return. Velith replied in 4 minutes. Kethara Retrieval Wing Vantek. Your withdrawal request is acknowledged and authorized. The channel will remain open. The Accord will receive any subsequent communication at your convenience. Safe passage to Keth 3. That was it. The formation began to move. A slow, measured acceleration, military spacing maintained. No variance. They were not fleeing. They were withdrawing with the deliberate dignity of a force that has found a situation it was not equipped to resolve today, and is choosing to resolve it correctly rather than quickly. I watched the signatures on my screen change from stationary to receding. At 11 hours, I transmitted the formal end-of-contact log to Veleth. At 12:17 hours, Veleth acknowledged. At 12:19 hours, I closed the special log I had been maintaining since the first alert tone and filed it to the archive. I noted the contact classification, duration, the outcome, and the current status of the wing. I noted the Protocol 19 activation time and termination time. I noted that no weapons had been armed on either side, that no vessel had deviated from its authorized approach or holding position, and that the exchange of transmissions had been civil in register throughout. I noted the Accord's response time to the historical vector contact and noted that all pre-positioned assets had been in place before the wing would have had reliable sensor coverage of Earth's orbital environment. I noted this not because anyone who would read the file would be surprised by it, because documentation is how the work stays done. Someone will read this file in 400 years, or 4,000, and the record will be there. The record is always there. Galveth brought me the last of the soup. He set it down next to the console without a word and stood there for a moment, looking at the screen where the formation signatures had been. Then he looked at the much quieter display where the receding signatures now showed, shrinking toward the outer system. Same thing, eventually, he said. If not them, someone else. Probably, I said. Good thing the buoys are already out. He said it the same way he said everything, flat, certain, not looking for a response. Then he went to make tea, because it was his turn in the rotation, and the rotation had continued throughout all of it, as it always does, as it always will. I ate it at the console, watching the receding signatures shrink on the screen. Senny was doing her own paperwork, the ordinary paperwork of a sensor posting that has just been, for 3 days, something other than ordinary. Plateau was cold. It is always cold. Outside the shelter, the basalt ridge ran for 11 kilometers in both directions, black and flat and indifferent, conducting whatever vibrations the planet chose to send through it. The array listened. The array had been listening for a long time, and would listen for a long time after we were gone. 6 months later, I was rotated off Calith and reassigned to a posting at Neville Station, which is a deep-water monitoring hub off the eastern coastal shelf, with considerably better amenities and considerably less quiet. I was promoted to Class 4 before the reassignment, which my supervisor at Veleth Orbital attributed, in her written note, to exceptional composure and documentation discipline during the Protocol 19 event. I accepted the promotion. I did not argue with the characterization, though composure seems like a generous word for what I was doing, which was watching screens and making coffee, and trying not to think too hard about the size of the thing that had just almost happened. The Kethara Wing returned to the Keth 3 marker as promised. They opened a channel 4 months later, not the 6 to 14 they had projected, which the Accord's diplomatic contacts interpreted as a sign that the Kethara Administrative Authority had reached its conclusion faster than anticipated. The initial diplomatic exchange was brief and formal. I did not read it at the time. I was at Neville by then and had no particular access to the classified diplomatic summaries. But I read the declassified summary 2 years after the fact, when it was published in the Accord's Standard Foreign Relations Digest. The Kethara Administrative Authority had reviewed the 9,417 pages. They had reviewed the Theron Convention. They had reviewed the 47 ratifying signatories, of which, as it turned out, 3 were entities with whom the Kethara had active treaty relationships. They had reviewed their own colonial records from the original administrative period, apparently contained documentation that had not survived in any form, available to Accord archivists, and which the Kethara were now prepared to share as part of establishing a mutual historical record. The diplomatic summary did not specify what those records contained. It noted that the Kethara Administrative Authority had acknowledged the completeness and legal sufficiency of the Accord's transmitted record, and had expressed in formal diplomatic language what the Accord's translators rendered as recognition that the current situation is the result of a synapsed interval during which independent development occurred that was not accounted for in standing Kethara administrative planning. A significant elapsed interval, 35,000 years rendered in formal diplomatic language. The summary also noted that the Kethara had proposed a formal exchange program under which their historical documentation from the colonial period be shared with the Accord's archive authority in exchange for access to the Accord's full public development record for the same period. The Accord had accepted. The exchange was ongoing as of the digest's publication date. I thought about that for a long time. The Kethara administrative records from 35,000 years ago, sitting in someone's archive on a world I have never seen, about to be transmitted to Tharan City for cataloging. Information about a period so distant that the people who lived through it are not even names anymore, only patterns in the sediment. What did the Kethara think they were leaving when they went? Did they see when they looked at Earth from whatever orbit they held while the administrative withdrawal was being completed? Did they look back? Did anyone in that departing formation think about what they were leaving behind? I do not know. I may never know. The records may tell us something or nothing on that question, depending on what the Kethara's administrative documents chose to preserve. But I know what they found when they came back. They found the array on Kalath Plateau is 11 kilometers of black basalt and sensors, and 6 people in heat prefab shelters, drinking cold coffee and logging telemetry. They found Velith Orbital, which is a coordination hub with a direct line to every relevant authority in the Accord, and a response posture that had been planned across generations. They found 193 warships in reception formation and 8 orbital platforms at operational status. They found 9,417 pages of certified legal record transmitted to their command channel before they had finished reading their own passive sensor sweep. They found us waiting, not angry, not triumphant, not scraping together a defense at the last moment, with whatever we had on hand, praying that it would hold. Waiting. The way you wait when you have done the work across the full span of the time available and you know the work was done correctly. The way a well-kept archive waits, patient and certain, knowing that the record is complete and the record is enough. I filed my contact log. I drank the last of the cold coffee. I watched the signatures on my screen get smaller and smaller until they crossed the outer system threshold and picked them up on the other side, moving steadily toward Keth 3, and the array toned down from operational priority to standard monitoring. And somewhere outside the shelter, the basalt ridge sat in the cold and conducted nothing in particular. That is the whole of what I saw. The rest is in the record. The record is always in the record.